Hello, I'm Morag, and welcome to this special episode of Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, a conversation from the 2024 International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. In this festival, I invited my friends and colleagues to join me in conversation, idea sharing, music, film screening, poetry reading, and storytelling. I was joined by educators, Indigenous leaders, designers, artists, scientists, activists, scholars, practitioners, philosophers, writers, filmmakers, and musicians, exploring ways to broaden and deepen permaculture possibilities. There were 35 speakers at the live event across 8 days in May 2024, spanning 6 continents and over 2,500 registered people for these live events. What an extraordinary event, and I'm so honoured, delighted to be able to share these with you. In this episode, I'm joined by Nora Bateson in an exploration of the ecology of communication. Nora also shares readings from her latest book, Combining. Nora Bateson is an eminent systems thinker, filmmaker, and writer, navigating the complexities of our interconnected world with intergenerational insight and clarity. As the president of the International Bateson Institute, she tends dialogue on ecology, culture, and education. Nora's father, Gregory Bateson, considered a leading figure of ecological thinking of the past century, is the subject of her award-winning documentary, An Ecology of Mind. She's the author of 2 books, Small Arcs and Combining, and the founder of Warm Data Labs and the People Need People sessions. She inspires audiences worldwide to explore our ecologies of communication as a response to the polycrisis. She values contextual, permaculture-inspired responses and lives in Sweden with her family. Before we head to the conversation, I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm recording this episode from my hand-built, solar-powered studio here in beautiful Gubbi Gubbi country with Jinnaburra lands to the east. I'm surrounded here by my permaculture forage gardens in a permaculture eco-village. This podcast is a project of the Permaculture Education Institute. We teach permaculture design, teaching, and livelihood skills online to people on 6 continents, who in turn localize and enrich it and find appropriate ways to apply the planet care ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share wherever they are. Check the links below to find out more about our programs. And remember to subscribe to Sense Making the Changing World on your favorite podcast app, to share it freely, and to leave us, please, a 5-star review and a lovely comment, because it really does indeed help people to find this podcast. It's my great pleasure to finish off this beautiful gathering with my dear friend Nora Bateson, and I'm so delighted to have you here. I find it really hard to introduce you, Nora, because you are just so many different things. There's not one thing that I can say that this is Nora. But except to say that when I came into connection with Nora's way of thinking and speaking and writing and holding space and hosting conversations, I went, yes, this is what makes sense to me. This is how I feel like I can thrive. This is how I feel like I have a voice and I can speak to the things that are in between the thingness of everything else. When I'm no longer a gardener, I am the gardening. There's this whole different qualities that come out. So welcome, Nora, to this session.
Thank you for inviting me. And what an incredible series you've made. I love it.
It's just been a wonderful way to touch on the multiple dimensions of what permaculture is, rather than saying this is permaculture and this is how we teach it and this is the curriculum. It's what are all the different ways of thinking that are around permaculture? What's underneath it, beside it, running through it? And so sometimes we point to permaculture, other times it's just the context around it. And it's this kind of approach and this kind of invitation to come and play with this that I've been inspired by in being in connection with the warm data work.
Yeah, it's not just a methodology, it's a whole way of perceiving the world and learning to be in it. And so it's not even static. A permaculture is not, someone said Nora is a verb, permaculture is a verb.
Yes.
It's continuing to shift and move and become more saturated into our lives in so many ways, so many metaphors. So yeah.
And I think too that shifting from seeing the things. So as a design teacher, a permaculture design teacher, before we would say, well, what are the things you need to include in a permaculture design? You'd point to the things and, okay, we need all of these to be connected. But what your work points to is not just the relationship between things, but the qualities of the relationships or the relational process. And that is different, and that deepens the conversation to whole other dimensions. And I really do think that, a warm data approach in the world of permaculture can help us to really understand and create kind of living systems and community spaces that have so much more aliveness.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about this right now. I'm in my personal world. My mother had a stroke a couple of weeks ago, and I'm in this very existential place of being 56 years old and recognizing what it is to think about my identity in another way, because that's what happens when someone who has been in your world since ever, no matter how that relationship has been, right? So she has been my fight, my push, my pull, but she's been there. And so there's this place where there has been a wall where there's no wall. There's a place where there has been some sort of articulation in my life where now there's a wordlessness, a languageless place. And I think when I'm thinking about your work and the permaculture right now, I'm thinking so deeply about these ways in which we are carrying the artistry and the benevolence of our ancestors, but also those things that have been bags of rocks, that you can't put down because they become extensions of who you are. And you accidentally reach to embrace someone and whomp them with your bag of rocks. And I'm really feeling that right now, that there is this whole ecology of being in this intergenerational relational process and communicational process, and wanting desperately with my own kids, not to pass these things on, recognizing we are at a time when, these things that are old, these bags of rocks, cannot be passed along. This next gen does not have time for these bags of rocks. And so that's, Morag, your generation, my generation, we're holding this. And what does that look like? So it's this thing of, it's got to keep moving. How do we keep the movement happening, especially when the things we're holding are invisible? Mm-hmm. They're things you don't even know. And then they jump out and you think, oh my gosh, there it is. Yeah. But that's part of the permaculture of our social, intergenerational learning, our communal learning.
Mm. It also really brings out this question around, often the permaculture movement is a thing, and the permies are a thing, and there's a kind of a way, there's a curriculum, and to be change makers in the world. And it's just shifting away from all of that kind of narrative into a different space. It's something that you said in one of the early, I can't remember whether it was a talk or whether at the course, and when you're talking about how, a shift in perception is action. Mm-hmm. There's so much about the doingness of everything, whereas actually it's in the ecology of communication, and it's in our perception. And I wonder whether you could just speak a bit to that, because I think that's such a powerful part of this moving that's going on.
Yeah. I mean, it's that question, what do I do? Right? What do I do when whatever is happening in my world is something that I feel I need to be a participant in the change? Okay, so how do I do that? And the doing is informed, deeply informed by the perception of the world that it's taking place in. And so it's not just doing, it's doing from a particular selection of possibilities of what that doing could be. So for me, I think the work that we've been doing with warm data has really been about shifting those possibilities of what's it possible to do, what's it possible to communicate, what's it possible to say, what's it possible to perceive, because then the action selection changes. So if you ask, for example, let's say you have a kid that's not doing well in math class. So what do you do? Okay. If you are operating from a, sort of general epistemological, cohesion with the world around us, the response might be, oh, well, you got to get a math tutor. You got to make them buckle down on math. You got to, focus on the math. But if you look at where this math is sitting in, and you start to perceive yourself and the kid in relationship to a society and a culture in another way, what starts to be the question is not how do we buckle down on math, but how do we actually create the relationships and communication that will shift the math without shifting the math. So when this occurred with us, it was first this thing happened where I actually asked my stepson to spend the weekend helping me take care of my mother. And you would think that that would have nothing to do with math class, but it has everything to do with how that person, that stepson, that young being, that soul perceives himself in the world. And when he perceives himself in the world, and he's had a couple days to look at how it is to be 95, to think about the expanse of a lifetime, where math sits is very different. And our polarity and argument about you have to stay home and study for math becomes actually completely irrelevant. And so this shift in perception shifts the way he is in math class. But it looks nothing like addressing the math issue. And this is my point, is that the shift in perception is the shift in action, because the shift in perception shifts everything. It also shifts how he's eating, how he's living, how he's being in relationship with his friends and his world. So of course the math shifts, and it's that thing where it's not what you thought. Yeah.
It's pulling away from the pointing at a particular thing and trying to fix this proclivity we have to fix stuff. And it feels to me like that's a big part of the environment movement and the ecology movement, is to try and to fix things. And there's so many things to fix that this, exactly what you're saying now, does to me feel like it opens up an enormous amount of possibilities and helps to get us out of this stuckness that we find ourselves in. And so it's the other words that I have really taken on board is this sort of notion of steeping and stewing and adding context, and all of this, rather than trying to fix something, is like how to add the context or add it into like the soup, like add more ingredients into the soup. And these things are kind of very easy to understand the way that you describe them. They're not using any complex language, although you do have some very complex languaging through story and through this way of describing how change happens is, I don't know, it lifts my heart. It feels in a way kind of revolutionary.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about the permaculture world and the question that we've been working with warm data around who can I be when I'm with you? Who can you be when you're with me? Right. And right now I'm asking that question in another way with my mother. Who can I be without you? And that's another whole kind of question, right?
Yeah.
But recognizing that the who I am is really different in the same way that if you are a carrot next to a squash, you're a different kind of, there's a different sort of possibility next to a dandelion, next to it, right? So there is something that's happening in those contextual relationships. And if you change the contextual relationships, you change what's possible.
Yeah.
So what are the ways in which that participation can be held with grace and not with manipulation? Okay, so the spirit of manipulation is the same spirit of industrialism, the same spirit of control, the same spirit. And so that shift of the lightness or the openness, the multiplicity of context, the possibility, opening the possibility space, but not with intent to manipulate. Mm. If there is this intent to manipulate, it goes belly up in a hurry.
And this is a really interesting challenge in something that has its basis in design, is how to be in that state of grace and state of deep connection and observation and broadening your perception while thinking about design. And so this is the question that I've been holding and playing with ever since I started connecting with your work. And it's been a great question to hold. And even just holding that question has shifted how I respond on a daily basis to it.
And I think one thing is that it's never one thing at a time. Nature never does one thing at a time. And somehow we, as humanoids, have gotten into the sort of mechanistic habit of thinking you can pull things apart and solve things one at a time. And Mother Nature is the ultimate multitasker. Right? So, design for something becomes a problem. Design and something is interesting. Right? When you see a piece of art and it really is only saying one thing, it's not really going to have the depth or the movement or the possibility in it that a piece of art that shifts in its that shifts as you shift, you see different things in it. So my grandfather used to say that you can only see genius in two places, in nature and in art. I really liked this. And he said, science will never achieve it, but should always be inspired by it. As a scientist, because he was a scientist, this is an interesting thing for him to say. And it took me, a while to figure out what he meant by it. But he said he basically was speaking to the way that all of the organisms in a meadow or a forest are in communication and in mutual learning and shifting each other and changing in relationship to each other and in this incredible communion. That this multiplicity of different kinds of communication and possibility is the same as with art, that there's lots of different kinds of communication and possibility. And that it isn't static, it isn't single purposed, right? So it's this single purposing that is, I think, really at the heart of a bad habit. It makes me want to read Harvest. Should I read Harvest?
Please do.
So this is a piece that I wrote. This is from Combining. Morag asked me to read to you guys today. So that is my task. All right. So this piece is called Harvest. Be careful. A hasty harvest is an unfeeding. It is non-food. Harvests are patient history and quiet roots that start tiny. And while compost is necessary for the growing season, do not eat the compost. Wait. The eggshells and onion skins bear little resemblance to the conversation at the table where the meal they fed feeds you. Wait. The industrial craving for instant food, ideas, and plans distracts from entering ecological time. An apple seed in the ground is not an apple. It requires seasons, years, changes in light, wind, temperature. It must reach up into the spring sun and down into the winter earth. The blossoms need the insects and the song of the baby birds. This is not the time to harvest. This is the time to let these ideas come to find other contexts in the underground, in the wilderness. Notice the unecology of the question, what is the point? A meadow never asks such a thing. Life is making life, nothing less. The harvest is a time of golden brown, reds and deep orange tones. The harvest is marking the long journey into the squishy death and rot that offers new compost. It is the last moon before the cold comes. Do not race into winter before it's due. Harvest is long in its arrival. Sometimes it comes with an empty basket, leaving its lost leaves and roots to decompose, feeding the possibility of next year. Likewise, let the ideas and stories of today remain in the undergrowth. Let them find new contexts, new contacts, new life. Let the movement of relating follow its own reachings. Let it touch and rename itself as it moves. This is the beginning. This is the middle. Let it form and inform. Do not ask what you will get out of this. This is the making of next year's rain. The point of the meadow is a meadow 100 years from now. Ecology is not instant. You cannot run to the shop and buy it. There is no summation, nothing to put in your pocket, only idea seeds in warmth and moist history. Relax. The possibilities are brewing, stewing. Let them wander and shape in ways you may never have considered.
I love that. What's the point? We're so caught up in the efficiency of things and wanting to know what we're going to harvest from things. And this piece is titled Harvest. And in the conversations that you host in Warm Data and People Need People, and it's not about the harvest. It's about that ecology of communication. And I wonder whether you could describe a little bit about the difference between that, because so many meetings and conversations that you have in various community organizations is about the harvesting the ideas or getting to the point of things. And we never quite get to it. We always get stuck. And the questions that people often ask is, how do I create community organizations that actually work? They keep getting stuck and people fall apart. Whereas where I feel the Warm Data approach can really help in this, I think.
It's an interesting question. Okay, so we're talking quite a lot in the world about systemic transformation. Throwing those words around like we have some sort of bodily understanding of what either one of them is. And I think it's really important to recognize that systemic change is never going to be at first order. So if you identify the problem and you're strategizing to get a solution to the issue, you're already out of systemic work. because systemic work is going to be the work that makes the work that makes the work that makes it. So, you know, it's that thing with the stepson in the math class that happens to move, not with the extra tutors, but with the weekend with the grandma. And the way that shifts all sorts of things, in the whole family. So the math is not the problem, and it's not the solution, but it's a manifestation of, it's an expression, a communication that's coming through our family system, that there is a place that needs tending. And the thing is that it's so tempting to think that what needs tending is the math. But it's not the math. So this thing about systemic shift is really tricky. That makes me want to read you the caterpillar. Should I read you the zombie caterpillar? There once was the most adorable furry caterpillar. It had lots of wondrous little legs that moved like rows of dancers as it scooched up and down the stems of flowers. And each day it looked forward to munching leaves. And then one day it heard the news that it would soon cocoon, and it would no longer be a caterpillar. It mistrusted the idea of flying around. It was unsure of what or who it would be in another form. It became greedy for more time, being furry and many-legged. It knew life as a caterpillar was a proper and good life, and could not yet understand what it would be like to not be a caterpillar. So it began to bargain with transformation. It wanted to preserve itself unchanged, stealing time and wagering against the meadow it lived in. It hedged its bets and distorted its appetites. Whenever it felt the urge to cocoon, it made adjustments to sustain its caterpillarness until it became a zombie, an untransformed mockery of the lovely little thing it once was. The butterfly that it might have become was postponed. The owl-eye spots on its wings were interrupted. So I think that's an interesting counterpart to the harvest piece, right? Of this eagerness for change that we can control. But are we actually trying to control change or trying to produce some sort of continuum? Are we hedging against the meadow we live within? Mm-hmm. And so for me, that way of thinking about systemic change must be able to move beyond where you think, into contexts you weren't imagining, possibilities you didn't think of. But that's super hard. It's super hard.
It is, because, you know what you know and what the group knows, and to be in that space to open the possibilities. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that shift in perception. Mm-hmm. I'm only asking these questions because they keep coming up all the time for me in conversations that I get asked about. How do we shift when there's, there was even a question in the earlier conversation with Satish. It's like, yes, I understand what you're talking about with radical love, but the people around me don't get it. How do I move the dial? I don't know how to frame a question about this, but I wonder whether you understand where I'm trying to go.
I do. And let's go to your metaphor, because it's this thing of don't eat the compost, right? If you're going to make a space for something to grow, first you have to have rotting onion skins. Don't eat them, right? They need to go underground. They need to be in the soil. They need to have that time. And this, so there is a way in which we keep putting seeds in the ground and pulling them right back out again. You have a conference and you leave with takeaways on the flip charts. No, you won't know what you learned until you go home and you're in relationship with your family and you see how what you've learned makes you a little different. And maybe your family will notice that you're responding a little bit differently, that something has shifted in your tone, in your way of being, in your approach. And maybe that shift allows them to shift in their tone, in that communication. And when that shifts, their identity shifts a little bit. And so yours does. And then they go off into their other relationships and they're a little different. And so those communications begin to shift a little bit. But that's where the perception shifts the relationships. And it's a thing of asking a different question. There's this piece. I'm going to read you. Morag said, read a lot of pieces. So I'm here to read to you. This piece is called To Live in Another Way. At first, it appears it is the parts of the system that must be made better or fixed. Then, it becomes clear that the system is not in the parts. It's in the relationships between them. So, it seems like it's the relationships that need to be made better, fixed. But relationships, it turns out, are made of communication. And then the communication becomes the place to address the needed adaptations. And then you realize what is communicated is not what is expressed or even what is not expressed. It's what it was possible to express. That is where the limits move, in the combining. How shall I tend to the premises of what is possible to communicate?
Yes. And it's the tending part there that I find really interesting, how to tend to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you tend to that? And I think it requires us to have an affection for life and to be willing to meet those hard places, to recognize that our ancestors have been destroying things and making things, that we cannot justify the exploitations and the harm, but we cannot despise them because they are of us. And so how to be in this moment, holding these mutual learnings with each other, between generations, between organisms, and not shy away, not turn away. And there's moments when that's really, really hard. I mean, it's deeply connected to who we are, our identity, our understanding of what is your name? Where's the edge of your body? What makes you lovable? What is success? And here we are holding this.
And most of that is something that we don't see or notice or touch very often. It's that submerged piece. And this awareness, when you spoke to that, my mind felt a flourishing because we have in systems theory been focusing mostly on emergence, what we see, what's coming out, what are those things that come out. Whereas when you speak to what is submerging, or it talks to some completely different way of understanding how we can be in the world and how we can respond. And I wonder whether you have a reading that relates to submerging.
Oh, submerging. Oh, wow. Well, I was going to do what I learned.
Okay, great.
Let's do that because that's kind of nice how that fits in. There's a lot of things I'd say about this, but I'm not sure I would say it's kind of nice. This is a piece that it's called What I Learned. I've been seeing one small piece of the landscape, a branch of a forest, believing it. Then the forest revealed, and I feel I have been so inept. It's a reminder of the cost of thinking my knowing is anything. I'm learning that learning is the healing. Not backtracking, not rehashing, not splitting words, not attempting to save face, not apologizing. The only currency here is movement. Learning is moving to a scope from which there is no return to past limited vistas, no going back to not seeing, no hiding in old ways of not sensing. It's a one-way valve that changes everything. It changes me. I'm learning to see the outlines of my own misplaced knowings. I have learned to watch for signs of cocky within the stance of clarity. That self that thinks I already knew is a version that cannot offer anything new. And now when that version of self shows up, I will recognize her. I learned that learning is a relief, like oxygen rushing to limbs that were in bondage. I'm learning to question the images and the stories I was told, to smell the blood in them, and learning to spot the frames, bars, bondage so camouflaged into the culture. I'm learning not to hope to solve the past harms. The pain that sits there just sits there, caught between now and 400 years of torn lives. Nostalgia has no place here. It's a blade through the scripts that obscured and justified. I know better than to think I could see this history, any history I do not see, I cannot know. My effort will never be complete. It will never count. It will never be enough. I will hold in open rigor the ongoing learning. But I am able to sense a little more than before. Learning to balance in the instability of a wall-less, floorless world, seeing one small piece of the communication, a single word in a whole language, believing it. Then the conversation revealed, and it was time to be silent. I am so curious about that world, that realm, that vastness of all that we do not perceive, cannot perceive. The way that one culture has words for things that another culture doesn't. The way that one way of living creates sensitivity that another way of living has absolutely nothing there. The way that living in Sweden, my husband sometimes accidentally translates the idioms, and they are so ridiculous because they're completely entrenched, entangled in a whole set of logics and perceptions of a culture that I can't see. And so, we're driving along and this BMW scoots in front of us. And he says to me, "Who's that guy sliding in on a shrimp sandwich?" And, there's this thing of like, wait a minute. Can we talk about that idiom for a second? Sliding in on a shrimp sandwich. So here we have all these kind of like indicators of symbols of what is posh and what is arrogance and what is, what is cheating and what is all these things, right? Here's this guy sliding in on a shrimp sandwich. And I had no idea. But that's the sort of thing in a very lightweight, description of a world that for each one of us, there is so much more. And I guess that when I'm thinking, what's in the soil, what can we do? What is that thing that is the shift in perception? It's for me this ongoing learning and sensitizing and finding these places where I did not see. Yeah. I could not perceive. And when I say see, I mean smell, touch, feel, sense, right? I mean, if we were alive 15,000 years ago, we would have a very different way of perceiving, right? So my friend came up to me yesterday and said, they're doing all this neuroscience on what happens when people don't have goals. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, right? Who slid in on this shrimp sandwich? Because what do you mean by goals? If you mean linear metric goals that are singular in their purpose, that's one kind of goal. Okay, but when you're talking about you want to participate in the vitality of life, making more vitality, that's an entirely different kind of goal. And so it's not just goals that are the problem. It's the kind of goals that come with singular determination and linear process. Mm. And even those goals are fine if you're fixing a pickup truck. They're just not so good in families or, any kind of ecological system.
And measurement.
Yeah, measurement. I mean, if you recognize that every time you measure something, you have to pull it out of context. Any measurement is a decontextualization. So just know that.
Yeah.
And then when you look at it, you will see this is a decontextualized number. And then numbers are poetry, numbers are stories. That's all they are.
Yeah. And this is really to the core of what warm data is about, isn't it? It's like information that's alive, not the cold data, the warm data. And I liked what you said in that reading you just did then about learning is a relief.
Mm.
And that there'll never be enough, never be complete. It's like, that's such a relief to hear that in itself, because we have this sense that we'll get to a certain point, we're learning and we'll be a master, we'll be a professor or a doctor of this and we'll be something because we have that. Whereas learning being this continual process of unfolding and not knowing mostly, really, but sensitizing. I love that word, sensitizing. I feel like that's a really big part of the task.
I mean, I think when I think about those moments in my life when I have held really deep conflictions or conflicts or something that has been painful. And when there have been these moments where there was learning, where we actually figured out a way, we found something that allowed it to move. And the healing that happens there is such a relief. And it's not like the problem is fixed. It's that the learning that was holding the problem in place moves it. Mm. And so it's a very different, it's not like replacing a bolt. It's not a replacement program. It's a transformation of perception. like Monica's saying, it's a remembering, because that's what happens when there's learning. There's a way to be in the system in another way. You are in a different, your membership moves.
There's a question from Victor.
Can we consider a systemic change as a transformation rather than a transition? For a transition, you can envision the future, whereas for transformation as an emergence of a totally new structure, and which is unpredictable for what's coming, similar to the metaphor of the caterpillar and butterfly.
Okay, this is a good question. So let's think about this. I am really interested in, and there's a paper out there that you can find. If you just Google it, you'll find it. In what makes a system ready to make change? What's in the ready? So instead of thinking, how do we make this change? What are the ways in which there is the possibility of nourishing in a multi-contextual way those aspects that allow there to be movement? Instead of forcing it, and in which case you get these weird contortions of change. So for me, when you're talking about transition, what I would like to bring in there is really the concept of readying. And sort of what happens before the emergence? What happens before the change? What happens in the submergence? What are those aspects that are combining and coalescing and forming a nest of possibilities that then, when the organism or the system, whether it's a family system or a society or any kind of living system, then when it is in context, it actually can produce a different response. Instead of thinking we have to rearrange the furniture so that we get a new script, because you can teach people to have a new script, but that new script does not make them actually respect each other, right? The respect that you're looking for lives in the deep down. It lives in a coalescing of perceptions and sensitivities and ways of being in the world. So how to not get so easily trapped in this seduction that change can be implemented, and thinking, really from a different direction, how do we nourish the soil into which the change can happen? And so that for me is the difference between a transition and a transformation. So that readying process. But the thing is, you don't know where it's going to go. And if you're trying to produce a particular readying for a particular outcome, you're back where you started, in that industrial singular thing. For me, that's, getting at these more insidious issues, right? The things that we're trying to undo, the corruption, the greed, the racism, the various forms of addiction to consumerism, to substances, to behaviors, to forms of identity. These things are insidious, which is, the word insidious actually means that it's something that's been formed gradually over time that then emerges as a harmful effect. But you can't get to it by trying to deal with the effect, because it was cooked in this combining, this coalescing that was in the underground. And so how to meet that is really, I think, a very important question right now, because the rush to fix these things is the same thing as an industrial fix. It's not really holding those. And the thing is that we have an ecology of issues, which is to say that they are interdependent, shifting each other, and that they are a lot. There's a living world. Okay, people call it the meta crisis, the polycrisis, the omni crisis, the whatever crisis. It's these things coming together, but they're all moving. They're all shifting. They're all in some way in this constant responsive system. So how do we come into that? And for one thing, this is where I love the piece with warm data as information that's alive, right? If you have information that's static and you're trying to respond to this thing that's moving, of course you're going to have an issue. So how do we have information that is as alive as those things that we are trying to learn about and be in communication with and make room for these shiftings to take place? Yeah. Anyway, I hope that helps.
And as you are speaking, I'm translating this to a garden concept and being in relationship in the garden and how shifting our relationship with food and what we're, not trying to garden and control, but tending to the soil and tending to the diversity that wants to unfold from the diversity that's in the soil. Like there's this lifing that wants to happen. I have been experimenting in my garden of applying these different ways of thinking and allowing life just to happen. And where I try really hard to garden, I fail dismally all the time. But where I tend to the soil and I sit back and I just be part of that process of engaging through it, something else happens. And it really feels like the garden is such a beautiful place to learn what you're talking about. And it helps us to slow down and notice these things. And I just find it such a beautiful place in that and in community spaces to really start to play with these ideas.
Yeah. And in this moment, there is so much that seems impossible. And so those realms where there is a world of possibility waiting are, I think, very important to keep in mind. And they have everything to do with, I think, a recognition of the importance of the living world, of being alive, of the nature of analog contact and communication, right? As we go barreling into a sort of AI nightmare, remember you are a creature. Remember that you can sit in a dark room and have impressions flying all around you. You can listen to a piece of music twice and not have the same experience. You can make tears. You can daydream. You can get angry. You can be sad without knowing why you're sad. And these things are so important right now to treasure and hold on to. That feeling, when you end up on voicemail and they say push 1 for this and 2 for that and 3 for this and 4 for the other. And you get angry and you say, but I just want to talk to a human being. Like, that's really important. Hold that. Find that. Because that's the part that is actually going to allow for another. We can't forget that. It's one thing to say, oh my God, technology is taking over. It's another thing altogether to abdicate from being alive. Don't do that. Fight for the right to sit in a dark room, to daydream, to procrastinate, right? Yes. To have an irrational response to something, to have a dream that you can't describe. That reminds me. I'm going to read you the introduction. So this is from Combining. This book is offered to your pheromones that help you fall in love. I give this book to the you of so long ago that felt alone in not fitting into the world people called normal. I offer this work to your one crazy eyebrow hair with a twist of its own. This book is for your breath, coming and going unannounced, making you implicit in the same wind that moves the clouds and the trees. I dedicate this book to the way in which you know, even as you try to describe a dream, that your words cannot express the vivid realm you encountered there. But you grope for language anyway. These untamed and unmappable phenomena are reminders of uninvited possibilities to be alive together beyond illusions of control. To these possibilities, I offer everything I am.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being here today. And thank you for reading. I kind of begin to imagine how much joy I am getting from just opening up one day and just each day to a new page and finding what I discover there. It's really, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you're doing, Morag. And thanks everybody who came today for all you're doing. And we're all in it together. So let's hold each other, tend each other in love and affection.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World from the International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. Check out the show notes below to find the link to Nora's website and where you can actually find all the conversations that happened at the 2024 International Permaculture Festival of Ideas. And also check the show notes for where you can find details of our permaculture courses and resources. Make sure you're signed up to hear news and updates, and come and join us at the Permaculture Education Institute to learn practical skills for designing and teaching permaculture and making a good livelihood while living a permaculture-inspired, one planet way of life.